Hi, welcome to my channel. This is a talk on what I call the single language coder. And I certainly am not talking about someone who happens to use one language in their day-to-day job and would be happy to transition to something else if another job came along, or obviously would like to really use something else in their current job. No, this is really talking about the vocal minority of programmers that insist that one language can be used for the vast majority of a large set of domains, despite increasing evidence to the contrary, for example. And for those of you that just say, hey, wait a minute, is this going to just be another video saying that JavaScript and TypeScript isn't that great? Well, obviously, there's going to be some of that. And the reason being is that the most egregious example of the single language coder problem comes from that environment. And so, given that this is the most obvious and current example, I will obviously have to go over some of this ground. I will not try to retread everything. I will try to come up with some new perspectives as best as possible. I will have to kind of gloss over certain things, not to just get buried in detail or make this video too long, but I hopefully will try to make this somewhat more interesting than just going off and saying X sucks because it sucks, or sound too much just like, well, I remember back in the day, even though there might be some of that as well, and I do apologize. Now, that being said, if you're really not in the mood for that kind of video, certainly you might want to just step off the train here. But for those of you that are willing to go along for the ride and might also be happy to hear a little bit of the rant about certain types of things, then welcome aboard. So the thing about it is that the reason I have an issue with this is not because I'm currently doing web programming. Obviously, I'm not working, and I've talked about this before. My issue comes in from that I have seen the state of UI applications on the desktop and the mobile on the web not just hit a plateau, but they're getting worse and worse. And I find myself increasingly frustrated by the fact that web applications seem to get no better at all. And I have dealt with the same frustrations over and over and over again constantly, and nothing has ever been done to change it. It just seems to be the same things over and over and over again. And certainly it's one of those things where, as me as a person looking at this as a program, I have to look in the reason why. And increasingly what it kind of comes down to is that there's this insistence on this is the language and the framework you need to solve these problems. And the problem is that that language, which is usually TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, and React, which is a framework built on top of TypeScript, kind of becomes the prescriptive or default choice in a lot of the cases where people are saying either A, they have applications that already exist as a web app and that's the goal that they want to move to, or in the few cases where they're doing new development, then that is the goal that they want to start at. And the thing about that is that those languages, the web environment itself, and those frameworks prevent a substantial amount of complications that make it much more difficult to achieve parity with existing desktop frameworks, that in the end, the UI quality has to suffer because something has to give. There's only so much time, there's only so much talent, there's an increasing amount of demand for getting things out faster. Something has to give. And where that gives is the user experience itself. And the reason being is that it's not just, well, programming on the web is hard. It is. Programming cross-platform applications is hard. It definitely is. But the thing about it is that doing it in a language that doesn't have support for class-based hierarchies, virtual methods, so on and so forth, is doing it without the tools that have been proven to work spectacularly well for doing GUI programming. Object-oriented programming itself was inspired by coming up with better ways to do graphical programs. Smalltalk fundamentally was a language built around the idea of how do we make these applications better. In so much the fact that Smalltalk itself also had a large set of graphical tools for which you to program in and to develop with. In some cases, the first IDE or integrated development environment was literally Smalltalk itself. And what Smalltalk inspired, either with Objective-C on one hand, which was used by Next Step, and then ultimately was put into OS, and then ultimately was replaced by Swift, and C++, from which Qt and other types of things came along, and then languages like Java and C#. All of them used this fundamental paradigm of components, model view controller patterns, and object hierarchies to come up with very effective GUI programming environments. The DOM, JavaScript, doesn't work that way. And to overcome those fundamental limitations, to come up with more interactive single-page applications, as they call them, means you have to do so much more work to get to that point, and use much more complicated frameworks to get to that point, that something has to give, and the user experience is what has to give. The frustrating thing about this is that despite there being more and more opportunities for this not to be the case, in terms of WASM support and the notion of bringing WASM all the way to the forefront as a option for being used everywhere JavaScript is, it seems to be completely stuck behind a lot of organizational inertia, but also deliberate attempts to stall that kind of innovation out of a worry that, well, it will make a certain amount of skill sets irrelevant, as if TypeScript and React would disappear overnight just because you could do things in another language. And certainly that fear kind of also belies the fact that basically people would desperately love to use anything else but those languages in some cases because of those fundamental issues. Frankly, it's one of those things where TypeScript React applications can be very exciting and very interesting and very clever, and sometimes they can even seem a bit elegant. But frankly, what GUI applications need to be for developers is boring. They have enough time dealing with the fact that they're having to deal with logic and state management on the client and a server. The other aspects of it should not be exciting at all. It should just be dead, dull, boring code that increasingly, like I said, some AI should be able to turn out, or some junior developers should be able to turn out. But certainly it shouldn't be one in which you go to basically an AI or another code base, look at it, try to tweak it, and increasingly come buried in the fact that you don't know what it's doing anymore, don't have any idea why it's not working, the tools aren't there, and you're just stuck with no way out. And that's where a lot of developers on the website see themselves as. They get stuck in these types of things. And it's because of these fundamental limitations of that language. And there are a lot of people that were advocates of JavaScript that have pointed this out. There's plenty of people saying it's time to move on. It's past time to move on. But yet we have these people that are saying, oh, no. What we really need is not only just better things on the website, but what we really need to do is push React and these other types of frameworks into native programming, into mobile programming, and wedging them in there where there's no need. There's not, and the only reason that there comes out a need from this is that they're, again, can't have the resources or find the people that will be able to do things like, program more than one language. That's the only reason this demand is there. It's not because it leads to better technology or better experiences. It doesn't. There's an excellent example of this. Microsoft itself is trying to do this Outlook with a new set of Outlook, trying to say it's like, we really don't want to have a separate Outlook web page. We want to try to reuse the logic. And it's been a uniform and utter disaster. And the reason being is that they have found out that, wait a minute, these programmers don't have the idea of how to work with things like files and do things offline. There's a lot of things that are so new in terms of TypeScript and JavaScript, just because for so long you were interacting with an environment that didn't have a file system or didn't interact with a protocol that wasn't WebSockets. Wait a minute, you need to have an SDPT client? Well, we have to write that from scratch. Oh no. So you find all these things that, basically is like, if you actually have an OS, you need to use all these things there. And as people pointed out, the current Outlook works fine. There's got some tweaks in it, problems with it, but it's not necessarily a code base that hasn't proven itself to be very useful in the enterprise over 20 plus years. And it got to the point where it was so bad that what Microsoft put in there, which they never should have done in the first place, was they tried to put a toggle in saying, hey, try out a new Outlook experience. And when you're in the old Outlook, they had to end introducing a bunch of group policies to say, actually, no, don't do that. Don't provide those people those toggles. Don't let them turn them on, because all we do is we get a bunch of help calls because nothing works. So yeah, and I fear that that will become more and more common, that people will try to displace this, and that will make the desktop application environment and the mobile application environment even worse than it is already. And I've seen some other presentations that are saying that actually there's already been pushback on using React outside of these things in terms of mobile apps or what they call native apps, just because a lot of these things do pop up. And all of a sudden, it's one of those things where the underlying programming environments, not for iOS and Android, people just realize that they're just uniformly excellent. And, you know, a lot of cases, they're just much more mature and better than what you have to do on the web. And if you do not have to use the DOM, if you do not have to use CSS, then you shouldn't. You just shouldn't. There's just not any reason for that to be the underlying paradigm for a desktop application that's working mostly offline. And not only that, but increasingly it's infected the web and the fact that everybody is saying, oh, well, you know, a good web application has to be a single page application. Increasingly, it doesn't. There's a lot of applications that would be much better off as being multi-page applications that use a lot less of single page application paradigms and do a lot more of server-side based rendering and all that type of stuff that work amazingly well with that paradigm, because they're much more about that. For example, you know, they're like the McMaster's catalog. You don't need to have one single page there if you can quickly and easily browse through a set of pre-generated information and bring it back to the web there. You know, if you already have that organization in the back end of how this organization is organized, putting a simple layer on top of it in terms of URLs is a much better thing to do than try to come up with a single page application that will just end up replicating all that stuff to begin with. You know, and so there's increasing pressure on a lot of sides to do these types of things. And it's all being stalwarted by a lot of people that have too much investment in the way they're doing things now as being the only way that they could ever possibly do things, and seem to undermine any alternatives as well. It's one of those things where, you know, heaven forbid that you be using Angular, even if it works for you, despite some of its limitations for certain types of things. You know, is it supported by a fairly good group of people? Yes. Does it have a good community working with it still? Yes. Are people making improvements on it? You bet, right? But no, you can't use it because it's not React or not this or not Solid or whatever has been deemed the framework to use in your web space. And the fact that there are so many alternatives that it's churning just shows the fact that there is too much reinventing the wheel going on there, and that there fundamentally needs to be some fundamental changes to the environment before it'll be truly ready to be that single page application environment. And that may never actually be the case. There might actually be a pushback towards not having the web for everything and having just better desktop and mobile applications that take advantage of web capabilities to do things like background updates, constant application updates, so on and so forth. There might actually be people that might realize that in certain types of things, especially in the enterprise where you don't necessarily have to put things in the public, that basically that might be a better way to go. I certainly hope that's the case. I think a lot of enterprises have come to over-rely on web applications that are completely behind a firewall, where a desktop application would be working just as well, and those people would need to VPN into a Windows box anyway to get work done, because you're really copying and pasting moving things from application to application anyway. So now, that being said, is TypeScript and JavaScript the only example of this? No. Another interesting example would be the pushback against Rust in the Linux community, despite there actually being a need for replacing C in a lot of cases with a language that actually does not allow certain types of memory access patterns or things like use after free and all those types of memory problems that Rust disallows just by its very nature to occur. There's a lot of people pushing back, saying, well, you're just not using C smart enough, despite increasing amount of evidence that no, you can't use C well enough. If you fundamentally have certain things that C allows, you introduce security issues, and those issues are very hard to come up with until somebody finds them and they're exploited. And you are much better off not allowing them in the first place, so you can work on reducing your attack surface and other places of your application. And there is an amazing row of that in the Linux type of thing. And I was actually surprised that it got stamped down as much as it did from the very top, where Linus eventually said, it's like, look, just because like you like C and you're going to use certain C is going to be in a certain subsystem, you cannot tell people that are downstream or in other subsystems what they can program in. And if Rust is working better and they're integrating it and using APIs, that's all that matters. Be quiet. And some of those maintainers lost their maintainer position over this. Their intransigency, and in this case, just absolute unprofessionalism. It was just unbelievable that they were treating people that were donating a lot of their time and were basically just stomping on them because they wanted to get on the soapbox about how amazing of a C programmer they were. And thankfully, there's fewer cases of that in the web, but they do exist, and they are just as annoying as anybody I've ever seen. I can tell you, for everybody, one of the people like, I really like React, this is cool. There's the one or two people saying, it's like, look at how amazing I am because I am able to really understand all this stuff and look at all these applications I've made that work no better than a desktop application that people made 10 years ago. And when it really comes down to it, and I want to kind of stress this, and this is maybe the most controversial part about things like this, overcoming limitations of an environment is not innovation. It can lead to innovation. I can point out to Signals as an example of a very interesting idea that builds on things like events and state management in an interesting way that might actually be a good paradigm to move forward into other, basically desktop and mobile applications in other languages. That's an interesting thing to look at. But at the same time, it's just shoring up the fact that, JavaScript and TypeScript doesn't allow you to have custom events when you're dealing with the DOM. And that's a fundamental limitation of things. It just really makes things much more difficult. Same thing with the React compiler. The React compiler is doing things where it's going to provide a set of memorization and try to detect when things can be memorized, so it really not have as many re-renders and not have to put the burden on developers to know when you need to have memorize calls. It ignores the fact that problem should have never existed in the first place, that the framework should have evolved to stop that from happening whenever possible by whatever means necessary of organizing how you do things. Versus, as it was, basing some things so much on the interaction of code and markup to the point where that amount of re-rendering was inevitable because of how you did things. That you had larger and larger templates, and you had templates that didn't interact with other things. All this, how this was set up in basically putting together code and markup and not using the MVC pattern, will lead to this if you're not extremely careful. And again, unfortunately here, one of the things, again, is the best solution is to just sprinkle around memorization calls as best you can to just force this thing to happen. But that has overhead versus designing a framework where you shouldn't have done that in the first place. And again, it's one of those things like, look at the amazing things they're doing, this amazing innovation. It is innovation, but it's just a workaround for something that shouldn't be a problem there in the first place. And wasn't a problem, and isn't a problem in all the other frameworks, right? There's no frameworks out there where you have to really go off, and I say this sincerely, working with C# and other types of places. It's one of those things where you have to do something really, really bad and counterintuitive to how those frameworks work to force a dramatic amount of rewrites and re-renders in your environment. The whole frameworks are set up to try to really minimize that, such that the whole idea of saying, hey, do you need to redraw something, is really driven down to the very single point where it's like, oh, I just redraw this one part of this section, please. Or, oh, just scroll me, but I didn't change, so you could just scroll it, not redraw this. So there's a lot more to be had there. And a lot of it comes down from, again, it was built on a lot more mature environment that was targeted from that, taking on experiences from that go before the web. And I would say the other thing about that is that another example of that is like, oh, well, that doesn't really make sense. I don't want to use stuff. Well, guess what Chromium does? Chromium is another example of using object-based class hierarchies with virtual methods and all this other stuff to come up with a very, very good cross-platform browser. And I don't see anybody saying, hey, should we just rewrite this and should we just make this native, right? Should we just bootstrap this? We can bootstrap this in JavaScript and TypeScript because that is just insanity at bonkers. There's no reason to do it. It gives you no advantages whatsoever. You just end up miring yourself in goodness knows what. But I get the same time when companies don't do this because it's like, hey, I can't hire the C++ programmers to do this. Even Microsoft can't hire the C++ programmers to do this. So I don't blame certain applications in people that develop them for why they're so bad, giving all these pressures. But at the same time, the answer is not, oh no, more of the same language, please. And to come back to this as a personal standpoint, I feel it's much more important for programmers to be much more comfortable programming in multiple languages than is currently acceptable right now. And I want people to see coding and coding languages much more as dialects than completely different silos in which you can only basically become an expert in one or only really speak one and maybe use something else if you really kind of get into it, versus, oh no, this is all just a different set of tools I have at my disposal for coming up with the best way to solving a problem. Anyway, that's my talk. I'm sure a lot of people that have different opinions on this. That's just mine. And of course, this is much more commentary and opinion than basically stated, knowledge. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.